Welcome to this short video presentation on portrait photography. This is part of a series where I'll be looking at advanced photography concepts and techniques that relate to different fields of photography, and this one focuses on portrait photography. So portrait photography is essentially a photograph of a person or people that attempts to capture the personality of the subject or to tell a story about that person or those people. A portrait photographer's goal is not just to take a photo that looks nice or looks pretty of the person or the subject that they're taking a photo of, but it's important that they try to tell their story. So there are 6 ways or concepts that a photographer needs to consider when they are taking this photo to tell their story. There are 6 creative areas that they can alter or influence to make sure that that story is told the way they want it to be told. These are the depth of field of the image, the focal length, the lighting, the location, the pose of the subject, and the camera angle. These areas also relate to some of the other fields of photography. So as I'll mention at the end, if you want to learn more about any of these fields and how these concepts and how they relate to other fields, then please watch more of these videos. So depth of field is the first concept that needs to be considered. Essentially, depth of field, the depth of the field of focus determines how much of that image is in focus. So a shallow depth of field means that only, say, my microphone, if the webcam is the camera, a shallow depth of field might mean only my microphone is in focus. But as soon as you make that depth of field larger, the distance physically becomes larger of what is actually in focus, which means now you might have, if you have a large depth of field, you might have the microphone and myself in focus. So how does this relate to portrait photography? Well, shallow depth of field means less of the image is in focus, means you're going to have an image that looks like this, where you might have the subject that's in focus and the background might be blurred. This is a common technique used in portrait photography because it has a nice effect where the subject is the main focus of the image, like this one here. But also you can use a large depth of field to create an image like this one, where you might have a location that's really important to telling that story, as we said. So this character, his story is strongly connected to the location that he's in, and therefore a larger depth of field allows a photographer to have that location of the image shown in the frame, rather than using a blurred background with a shallow depth of field. So using that depth of field to contribute to the story. Focal length is the second concept we need to look at. Typically, photographers use a longer focal length to keep the focus tightly on the subject. So if you look at this image here, a longer focal length has been used so that the subject themselves are zoomed in on, basically, and the background, you can still see the background or the location of the image, but it's not necessarily the main focus of the image. The focus is strongly on that subject. So in this image, a wider focal length has been used, and that's because the photographer wanted the viewer to be able to see what's going on in the background behind that subject. And you can see that a pattern might be emerging with these 2 images here. A longer focal length has been used in this image, with a shallow depth of field, and a wider focal length, in order to include more of that background, has been used in this image with a larger depth of field. Same here, wide focal length, large depth of field, shallow depth of field, and longer focal length. So how can you tell the difference between, like you might be wondering how I know that this is a wide angle and this is not a wide angle photo. Well, the easiest way to tell is by looking at the distortion in the image. So if you look at this image, this looks more natural. You can imagine that you are sitting next to this person, and that's how that person would look in real life if you were sitting right next to them. It almost looks realistic, right? So that's because the image has been flattened or zoomed in, so it has that more natural perspective. Whereas a wide angle, if you imagine like a GoPro or any of those other sort of sports action cameras, where they have super wide angle lenses and you can hold it here and take a photo of yourself, but it's like really distorted and your face looks all over the place. That's because the angle of that focal length is so wide that it's taking a photo from this close versus from a much further away, a distance much further away, and just zooming in and flattening that image. So this image here, as mentioned, has that more flatter sort of natural look to it, whereas this one you can see when you look at the lines of the walls and the sizes of things in relation that are close to the frame versus things that are further in the background, you can see how it has that real drawn in effect, and you can tell that that's created by a wide angle lens. Same with this one here. Closer to the frame, this person's really big, and then things in the background start to really drop in size dramatically, and that's because a wide angle lens has been used. So again, the photographer might use their creative decision making to decide whether a wide angle lens or a longer focal length is necessary to take an image, depending on how necessary it is to have that background in the image to tell the story that they're trying to tell. So that's the second thing you need to consider. The third concept you would need to consider when taking portraits is the lighting. So there are two different types of lighting you might be using, and you need to ask yourself whether you're using soft lighting or hard lighting. So I'll go into this in more detail in another video, but essentially soft lighting is lighting that creates a soft image, an image that has a soft lighting effect on the face, and there is minimal shadows, and the shadows that are there are very soft and blurred and not defined. Whereas hard lighting creates much more hard and defined shadows. So if you look at these two examples here, this one here has soft lighting, therefore there's soft shadows and a softer lighting effect on the face. Hard lighting means there's a much more obvious difference between the light and the shadowy parts of the image. It's a much more harsher looking image in terms of the lighting. So they're both great photos. It just depends on the type of story you're trying to tell, the type of mood you're trying to create, and how you want to present your subject. The lighting can help you in doing that. So how do you have a soft light or a hard light? Well, soft light, the larger the light source, the softer the light. So if you are using, if you're standing your subject next to a window and it's a large window, then it's going to create a soft light source like this one here. But if you're standing your subject next to a small window and it's got a really harsh, narrower, it's creating a harsher and narrower light source. So rather than a big light source, I'm trying to think of an example. So say you go outside on a sunny day, a really bright sunny day, and the sun up in the sky, it's only a small little dot right up in the sky. And when it shines on you and you look at the ground, you've got a really defined dark shadow of yourself, right? That really harsh, defined black, dark shadow of yourself is created by a small, tiny light source right up in the sky. So it's a harsh, small, direct light source that creates a harsh shadow. Whereas if you go outside on a cloudy day and you can't see the sun, you've just got this great big white sky of just clouds. That essentially means that entire sky is now your light. So instead of having a tiny little sun, tiny little small light source as that creating the shadows, you've got this great big giant sky that's the light source. And that creates, and when you look at the shadows on the ground on a day like that with the clouds, you don't really have a shadow. That's like, if there is a shadow, it's just blurred and it's not really defined. So that's the difference. A large light source creates softer shadows. A small light source creates harder shadows. So at home, you could use windows, you could use the sky as a large light source. A small light source, you could use a torch or a phone camera or the flash on your camera or the sun or a small window like this one here. So it's about being creative with deciding what you use for a light source and then recognizing how it's going to impact the image. Is it going to have these harsh defined shadows like this one here? And is that what you want to achieve the effect and tell the story that you want to tell? Is this the type of lighting you need? Or is this the type of lighting you need to tell the story that you want to tell? So that's the creative decision making you need to consider. Next, you need to think about the location and how that relates to the story you're telling. So this image here, obviously, it's an important part of the story to have this subject in this location because they have that strong connection to each other. But sometimes you might have a subject that doesn't necessarily have a clear, the story that you want to tell about your subject might not necessarily relate to a specific location like this one here. In that case, you might want to get creative with using interesting locations like this one. So it could just be a house, like that could just be the bathroom lights shining down the corridor. But you've used such a shallow depth of field that it creates this sort of lighting halo effect around the subject, where it creates an interesting background and an interesting location, but it's not anything that takes the importance away from the subject. And same with this one here. Interesting background, but not strong enough to take away the importance from that subject. So you need to consider where you put your subject for the photograph, the location that you use, and how that contributes to the story that you're trying to tell. Similarly with the pose and the expression of your subject. So how you have them stand, where you have them stand, what you have them do with their hands, where you have them look, do they smile, do they frown, whatever pose or expression you have the subject doing should also contribute to that story you're trying to tell. So here with this example, we've got like fun, colourful, energetic background, fun, colourful, energetic sort of prop, like being the hat, and then a fun, energetic, happy sort of facial expression. So there's that connection between those three elements of the image, and it has that stronger effect in telling the story about that person. So you need to consider the pose or the expression of your subject and how that relates to the story you're trying to tell. And the final thing we need to look at is the camera angle. If you've ever studied film techniques before, you would have looked at how a low angle, so having the camera down low and looking up at your subject, will create an image like this, where looking up at the character makes them appear more powerful, versus looking down on a character makes them look more vulnerable, like this one here. So that's on a basic level, that's how camera angles work. But there are many other reasons why you might use a high angle or low angle. Or you might, like any camera angle or camera positioning, how you angle that camera, however you move that camera, what you include in the frame or disclude from the frame, based on how you angle it, will affect the story in a different way. So you need to consider where you don't always need to just go up to a scene and just go like this, take a photo from here. Sometimes you might want to get right down low and take the photo. Sometimes you might want to stand on top of something nearby and take a photo from here. Sometimes you might want to go right up close. Sometimes you might want to go far away. It's about positioning yourself and your camera in different areas and to get different perspectives to tell the story in a different way. So experimenting with that and knowing how camera angle and positioning affects the story is another concept that you need to consider when doing portrait photography. So just to recap, those were depth of field, shallow and large depth of field, focal length, wide angle and long focal lengths, soft lighting and hard lighting, the location, how it relates to your subject, the pose and the expression and how that relates to the story you're trying to tell, and the camera angle, camera angle / camera positioning, how you position yourself in the camera and what you include in the frame also contributes to that story. So these are the 6 concepts of portrait photography. As I mentioned, many of these concepts are discussed in some of the other videos. So if you want to learn more about them individually, please watch some more of those videos. Thank you for watching.